And this is the commencement of our study on retention and recruitment in the Canadian Armed Forces. And to lead off our study, we have with us Paxton Mayer, a doctoral student in international affairs at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton, and Professor Alan Okros at Department of Defense Studies at RMC. And so I'll call on Ms. Mayer for her opening 5-minute statement, and then go directly to Professor Okros. Again, thank you for your patience. Colleagues, I propose to go 10 minutes late. If that's all right, and I hope that's all right with our witnesses as well. So, Ms. Mayer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a witness for your study of recruitment and retention in the Canadian Armed Forces. This testimony, in addition to the provided brief and reference materials, provides my perspective on why the Canadian Armed Forces, the CAF, struggles with recruitment and retention, and what public perception and organizational changes the CAF should implement in order to face these challenges. Over the past 2 years, the CAF's intolerance, harassment, and abuse towards women, visible minorities, and the LGBTQ+ community have been consistently reported in the media and have therefore become public knowledge. This has surely negatively affected the CAF's recruitment and retention. However, even prior to this wave of publicity, the CAF was having difficulty in the recruitment and retention of its members. This is not a brand new issue. I understand that the CAF has tried to accomplish changing this public perception through online advertisements that show diversity. Although it's true that these advertisements include more women and visible minorities than in the past, they still lack the message of inclusion. Most of the ads focus on a single person at a time and often do not show that person interacting positively with others or show that person's life outside of their job. These ads have failed in the past as they do not show that these diverse individuals are respected and included at the CAF, that these individuals are free to be themselves, and that these individuals are able to achieve some kind of work-life balance. Of course, these ads would only work and are only ethical if this is truly the reality at the CAF, which was heavily suspected for many years and has recently been proven without a doubt to be untrue. Instead of depending on these sorts of ads, the CAF and its civilian oversights, which includes the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister, need to publicly admit to their failings and create a full-fledged strategy to ensure that these failings never occur again. The CAF requires an organizational culture change. The implementation of the strategy must also consider that there may be resistance within the organization to these changes, and to support must be provided to members, both supervisory and non-supervisory, as they move from resistance to exploration to commitment to this change. Finally, the CAF should implement a clause in its recruitment and performance reviews that allows for the refusal of work to applicants and for the removal of current members from the armed forces that are creating an unsafe working environment or who are being exclusionary. Just because the CAF is having issues recruiting and retaining members does not mean it should ever lower its expectations on this. After all, how can Canadians depend on the CAF to keep Canadians and its allies safe when the CAF cannot even keep its own members safe, even in non-conflict zones? Furthermore, the actual recruitment process of the CAF is hugely inefficient and lacks transparency. This deters potential CAF members, even if they were not deterred by the other shortcomings of the CAF. For instance, the recruitment process can take over a year, and its average length is around 200 days. And the CAF's career website and application process expect a university graduate, maybe even a doctor, to submit a job application without knowing the requirements, the salary benefits of the job, or the recruitment process or timeline. These issues are also partly to explain why the CAF has had difficulties retaining its employees. I would argue that the CAF's retainment challenges are because there are many better opportunities elsewhere for experienced members, such as employers that do not request their employees to work in conflict zones, employers that do not expect their employees to move across country, and employers that have the assets and budgets to provide their employees with competitive salaries and working equipment. A compounded challenge for the CAF's retention and recruitment goals is that many families now depend on 2 incomes. However, when one partner is required to move to remote locations for their career, it becomes practically impossible for the other partner to hold a job, let alone have any career independence. Further, it's difficult for CAF members' children to constantly be switching schools and making new friends. The CAF needs to look into possibilities for CAF members to be guaranteed the ability to stay in a single location for long periods of time and provide more flexible arrangements for families. These then need to be communicated to current members and potential members. The CAF, the Government of Canada, and honestly Canadians as well, need to realize that the CAF is competing with private corporations and even other government organizations for talent, but is lacking the resources to win. To mitigate this, the CAF must be given the ability to increase its salary budget, must create a welcoming and supportive work environment, and must determine new ways of working that provide more stability for its members and its members' families. So in conclusion, the CAF has multiple challenges to overcome in order to improve their recruitment and retention. At the end of the day, it is my belief that Canadians will choose to work for an organization they trust, an organization that is transparent with career potential and possibilities, an organization that provides a safe, diverse, and welcoming environment, and an organization that stands behind and supports their employees. Unfortunately, the CAF is currently not this type of organization, but I believe it can become one if it genuinely works towards organizational change. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Professor Okros.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to provide comments to the Committee on CAF Recruitment and Retention. I'm speaking from Toronto. I provided my land acknowledgement in my written submission. My comments will be in English. I've been engaged in aspects of research, policy, and delivery related to CAF recruiting and retention since serving and recruiting in the late 1970s. I recently conducted research on the future youth cohort to inform CAF decision makers, and I'm making contributions to culture change initiatives. To start, as Paxton has highlighted, two recent factors are of importance for the CAF. Throughput, which resulted in shortage of qualified CAF members, and the adverse publicity over sexual harassment has resulted in some declines in the number of women applying to join. There were no magic solutions to either of these overnight, although both are top of mind for senior leaders. More broadly, the CAF is facing long-term trends that are making recruiting more difficult. The battle for talent requires the CAF expand the pool of applicants. Three intersecting factors are of importance. The first is the increasing diversity across Canadian society, with a shrinking proportion in the CAF's traditional recruiting pool of straight white men. The second is that a number of young people are entering the workforce lacking required work knowledge or life skills. There's significant competition across employers for those who have successfully completed post-secondary education. And the percentage of these graduates who are straight white men is shrinking faster than in the overall population. The third factor is increased urbanization and the number of young adults seeking to live in major cities. And many who come from diverse backgrounds and are well educated. Joining the regular force means leaving these cities, which is why the demographics of the reserves differ from the reg force. We then hit the challenge that the CAF is not one job, but offers 100, and that many Canadians have only superficial knowledge of the military, have different reasons for joining, and have a myriad of questions. Recruiting is an intense personal activity with both the CAF and the applicant trying to assess right fit. So the CAF needs to attract more talented, educated, diverse Canadians, is facing stiff competition from other employers and from the bright lights of big cities, and needs to invest in expanding capacities to attract, inform, and select the right people. Turning to retention, I'll note that the CAF actually has lower attrition rates than most allies. Again, while COVID and sexual harassment issues have likely played a role in some leaving, the main factors have remained the same for many years. A key is the challenge of balancing work and personal life. The CAF requires a lot from individuals and puts pressure on demands due to operations deployments, to going away for training, to moving across the country are significant. The constant juggling of time and attention become too much as do the issues of partners lacking stability to pursue careers, the frictions of moving houses, finding new family healthcare providers, trying to get the kids signed up for sports teams, etc. The CAF actually provides more geographic stability than our American or Australian counterparts, but these countries invest more in family support systems, where if CAF members and their families are forced to fend more for themselves. The British Army has a slogan: you recruit the soldier, you retain the family. Fiscal decisions have made this more difficult to achieve, and some policies still reflect the assumption that every member with children has a full-time homemaker to look after them. Further, attention needs to shift from how many people are leaving the CAF to which people are leaving. There are serious issues when these are more women, diverse folk, or those from different cultural backgrounds, and especially when they do so because they can't reach their full potential. Who is getting promoted versus who is being held back in their career is an important factor. Finally, I'll suggest that the key issue for government is not the number of individuals in uniform, but what capabilities the CAF can generate and sustain. As has been demonstrated over the last 2 years, the CAF has significant flexibility to respond to unique taskings, but there are limits. Answering these demands has come at a cost. Part of what is needed to address recruitment and retention issues is actually the work of government, not internal defense leaders. They require either more predictability or the funding to enable increased flexibility. So the key questions are, what do Canadians want their military to be able to do? And what is government prepared to invest to ensure they can? The Russian invasion of Ukraine has focused attention on Canada's contributions to NATO, but we're about to enter flood season, followed by forest fire season, followed by potential ice storms or snowmageddons. And Canadians would still like us to have a few more than just a token UN Blue Berets. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Okros. Madame Carrie Lynn Finley, 6 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to both witnesses for being here. We really appreciate your testimony. Professor Okros, what factors make those who leave unsuitable for military service? How are they screened? Do you know?
So there's two parts to this. So there certainly are some individuals that are required to leave the military because they are not a good fit for the military. This usually happens in the first year to 3 years of military service. On occasions, it's because they're unable to meet the training requirements, meet the performance requirements. On some occasions, it's because of their professional conduct. There were certainly instances in the news recently of cases of young people joining that were not displaying professional conduct out on the West Coast. The military can engage in remedial action in trying to assist these people to understand the values and the standards and the behaviors, but on occasions they're not a good fit and they leave. The other reason, of course, is, as I said, a large number of Canadians have limited knowledge of the military. So as much as the recruiting system tries to inform them, once they join and find out what military life is really like, for example, what Army camping really consists of, or going to sea on the North Atlantic is not like canoeing in Lake Ontario, there are people that just realize it's not a good fit for me. In the long term, those that get past that initial adjustment, the real reasons for people leaving have to do with work-life balance and all the pressures on families.
I appreciate your testimony on that because it gives a pretty clear picture, and I know it takes a lot from families, even in peacetime, to see in the Navy, for instance, we have troops deploying for many months at a time. What would you say is the primary draw for people who do join? What is the primary draw for recruits? And one thing that's on my mind is we had great success attracting Canadians during the Afghan war. So it must have been something that was motivating them because we were in a war theater.
My comments would be people join for a number of different reasons. Some are attracted to earn qualifications, advanced education to improve their work skills, their qualifications. Some people are attracted to adventure and travel. There are people that want to challenge themselves. I would agree that there was a segment of the Canadian population that joined during the time that Canada was actively involved in combat operations in Afghanistan. But I think we also need to recognize there was another portion of the population that was not attracted by both the combination of those activities and, quite honestly, the recruiting ads that were being run at the time. It's a challenge for the military. People have multiple different reasons for why they join.
One of the issues that's come up, Professor, is whether the universality of service rules should be changed, especially to recruit people with specialized skills to fight cyber threats, for instance. What is your opinion on that?
I would suggest there is a value in reviewing universality of service and how it's applied. It can on occasion be an impediment for both people joining, and it can also cause people who are serving in the military that have developed highly valuable skills and experience to have to leave the military. The challenge for the military, and back to the Navy, is what the Navy refers to as sea-shore ratio. The more number of people that you have in uniform that have limitations on the type of work they can do, the smaller number of people in uniform that are having to spend more time away, do the the deployments, the operations, etc. So I think that's the struggle that the military has in finding the right balance there.
How am I doing, Mr. Chair?
2 minutes.
Okay. With respect to Canadians of diverse background, I'm curious as to how you feel the CAF has been doing in attracting Canadians of diversity.
I'll answer, and perhaps the other witness might be able to chime in on this one as well. Because I would agree the military has been trying to do so. I think there have been challenges in terms of the messaging. There's challenges reaching into the communities. I think to reach diverse communities, the military really needs highly tuned, tailored niche communications to make sure not only that the individual, but their family and other community members understand what decisions they're making and can support them in making the right decisions. Common broad advertising, and quite honestly restricted to NHL games or football games, is not reaching the full breadth of Canadians. So there does need to be some strategies there on reaching out to different communities with the right information for them to consider.
I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to ask you, what is the normal attrition for the Canadian Forces and what is the NATO average? Do you know?
The Canadian Armed Forces is roughly between 6 to 7%. NATO allies are anywhere to 8 to 10%, and some are higher. For example, the U.S. Marine Corps is over 10%, and that's expected. Other militaries are more used to young people joining, doing a couple of tours, and then leaving. So they've got a different personnel production system to bring people in, get them qualified very quickly, get them working quickly, and then have them leave. And that's not the system that the CAF has got.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just so that for the sake of those who are both on the panel but also maybe listening, Professor Okros, could you tell us what the universality of service is, that concept?
Certainly, universality of service requires that all members in uniform be able to meet a series of standards which enables the primarily physical standards, that enables them to be able to deploy to a vast range of environments, to do a vast range of duties. So it's a common set of standards that are applied to everybody in uniform, and particularly those who develop medical issues have difficulties being able to meet universality of service and can commonly end up being released from the military.
Okay, thank you very much. Madame Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses today. I'm going to begin with Mr. Okros, along the same lines as what both my colleagues just mentioned on the notion of universality of service. You also mentioned during your testimony in the beginning climate change, that we're about to face the floods and the forest fires and different things that we have not been focusing on because of our shift of focus to Ukraine right now. And to NATO in general. Do you see the fact that we have a retention issue, do you think maybe if we were to work differently, if the CAF were to work differently and try to retain or at least recruit new members in a completely different category, for natural events or things that happen here, like helping protect Canadians at home, I don't know, do you see a benefit to changing the way that we look at things and to changing the way that it currently works on recruitment so that people who don't necessarily feel attracted to going and combating outside of Canada could at least come and offer services to their country to help during a flood situation, for example?
So my basic comment is yes, I think there is value in considering this. There are other militaries that have, or countries that have differentiated individuals so that some countries do have more domestic response capability on different, either in the military, but different conditions of service or in a different organization. I think as Canadians start to recognize that what we used to consider the once in a century weather events are now going to be happening much more often. I think there is a likelihood that the Canadian Armed Forces might be called on more frequently. This is part of why I think we need to, at the question I said, we need to decide what do we want the CAF to do? Because right now the military is structured to deliver on what it's been tasked with doing, but then gets hit with these occasional requirements. Alternate models that could have people that are just focused on domestic context, potentially restructuring of reserves, etc., are all certainly things that can be considered. But it's a complex military system, so they need to be studied properly and not to go to short-term solutions that can cause unintended consequences. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Mayor, you spoke extensively about the need to recruit diverse Canadians, more women, in order to change the culture of the organization. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what types of changes are required that we can make at the government level that would actually see the difference, that we'd be able to see a difference in the CAF. I know that it's an organization that pretty much is run on its own and by itself and doesn't necessarily like taking orders from politicians. What are some ways around that?
I would say that government and the civilian oversight should take more of a stand and actually provide guidance to the CAF. It's our responsibility. But within the CAF, I would recommend, I think the biggest tool for change could be building allyship and really pushing away the idea of, the innocent bystander to these issues. And if we improve the training to allow people to understand, what is harassment, what is abuse, how to notice this harassment, and then what to actually do and what to say when it occurs. I think then, everyone in the organization that applies this training could slowly change the organizational culture. Unfortunately, though, this does require quite a bit of leadership support. And within the CAF and even outside the CAF and the civilian oversight, we're seeing that there's not that much accountability, unfortunately. So to me, the biggest thing that the government can do kind of outside the CAF is to show that accountability and to take accountability for the mistakes and really push the CAF to make those changes.
Thank you very much. Another question that I had is because you mentioned that there's a lot of competition between the CAF and basically the rest of the Canadian economy, all businesses. So what exactly does the CAF need to do to make it more attractive to educated and more well-rounded individuals?
I think the first point that I would bring up is probably the recruitment process itself. Right now, when you apply to the CAF as a kind of university graduate, so for an officer position, they don't ask any information about your resume, your CV. It's basically you go through, you provide simple kind of personal details, and then they ask you to choose your top 3 positions. And then they say that someone else will reach out to you and administer a test to see if you actually are qualified for those positions. within, competing with private corporations. Private corporations, you submit a full application. They go through many kind of initial questions, even applying to the government, they do the same thing. So, as an applicant, they feel like they're actually getting through the process. With the CAF, they're not getting through a process. The CAF is wasting a lot of resources, putting people in charge of this process that could be somewhat automated as well. And this increases the whole length of the process. Private corporations hire within months. That person is working at the position versus the CAF. It's, a year or more. Sometimes the training takes over a year as well. And to compete with private corporations, the CAF needs to quicken this recruitment timeline and also make it more clear to applicants what job requirements are, what's the salary, what's the process.
And you mentioned also a little bit about the
Madame Lambropoulos, I'm sorry to say
Apologies.
your time is up.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup aux deux témoins. Je vous invite à...
Thank you very much to the two witnesses. I have questions for both of you, general questions. First question. So there's a lot of talk of people leaving the forces, but we're not really talking about those who are remaining. We might think that these people love what they do, but it's possible that some people stay in the forces because they have no other options. They're not happy, and that doesn't help with creating a good work climate. It might be toxic because of that.
So I'll start on this one if I can. I think all employers do have some issues with regards to employees who choose to stay, but I would suggest that the majority of CAF members certainly do acquire valuable work skills that can allow them to move to other jobs if they choose to leave the military. So I don't think the idea that they can't get another job is the reason why they may not leave. Certainly people do stay in jobs when they're in positions that earn them pensions. So people may stick around for a little bit longer to be able to get pensions to where they would like them to be. I guess I would just in general say that I think the vast majority of those that are in uniform are there because they want to be there. I guess would be the main comment that I would make on that.
Peut-être une question.
Please go ahead, Ms. Mayer.
I was just looking at the departmental planning, and only 65% of the CAF currently would describe it as a positive workplace. So maybe that we are seeing the effects of people staying in the CAF who are not seeing positiveness or do not want to continue working there. But I agree. I do believe that once you've done enough experience in the CAF, there are a multitude of options in the workforce if you would like to leave.
Madame Mayer, pendant que vous êtes là, vous avez mentionné en début de...
Ms. Mayer, you said from the outset that people who contribute to a bad climate in the forces, they should be removed. But is the removal process, is it effective? And is this removal process even known by members of the forces?
Yes, that would be after a lot of training, a lot of awareness brought to the issue, a lot of one-on-one discussion to instigate effective and to maintain that organizational change over a long period of time. Eventually, the members who do not wish to change would have to be removed. Currently, it is difficult to remove members. This would be primarily for new membership, including in their contracts or including in performance management reviews, that, this is something that actually is valuable, having a positive work environment, having an inclusive work environment, and measuring them against, indicators that show that they are, participating in this diverse and inclusive environment. I think that would be the primary way that we could remove members over time who do not wish to change, those members who do not create a safe and inclusive work environment.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être, Madame Maillard, encore une.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mayor, again, you said that often people, when they sign up with the armed forces, don't really know what they're getting into because of misleading advertising. So should there be some kind of support service or some kind of service that would teach them exactly what they are getting themselves into?
Yes, I would agree that there needs to be more information about certain positions. The CAF does have recruitment specialists that talk with candidates. So I think there is kind of that opportunity for candidates to ask questions. I think the issue, though, is that candidates may not know what kind of questions to ask. And because the CAF website is so general in a lot of senses, I do think there lacks quite a bit of information. I think it would be helpful for the CAF to provide more information on each individual job. You know, as Professor Akras has said, there's so many different positions, so many different job requirements within the CAF, and to have just kind of general pages on salary, for example, doesn't really answer questions in particular jobs, right? So including that and, you know, providing maybe FAQs, an FAQ section during the recruitment process would be helpful. This would require, though, the CAF garnering more data on its recruits, more data on its employees, disaggregated data. Surprises were there when CAF members joined, that they didn't realize that this position included certain tasks and things like that. So I think there just needs to be more communication. And I think the recruitment officer could be a good starting point for that, for sure.
Okay. Dans l'autre sens, est-ce que les
Conversely, do the armed forces know exactly who they're getting? Is the offer of jobs specific enough, and is the advertising specific enough as well?
I would argue no, especially in seeing the current situation with the training that happened on the West Coast a couple weeks ago. The recruitment process, especially at the beginning, I don't think does it enough to just even weed out the candidates that aren't qualified for the position. You're allowed to click on boxes such as doctor, medical professional, without any proof that you have any kind of qualification.
Okay, we have to leave it. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Ms. Mass, in 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to both witnesses for appearing today. So last Parliament, I sat on the Status of Women Committee, and we studied sexual misconduct in the military, and we heard from Major Kelly Brennan, who said that General Vance was untouchable. And sadly, last week, we saw him walk away from criminal charges, quite a disappointing, in my view, at least, response from the judge involved. So there's seemingly all over an idea, or certainly the impression, that whether it's Prime Minister, former minister, judge, internally within the CAF, externally in the civilian courts, that there isn't that accountability, that there isn't that culture change happening. So how does the CAF, there's certainly a willingness, and I believe that there has been a lot of conversations from the new minister, from General Eyre, to want to change, but how do they get past, in terms of this recruitment retention, the impressions that we're still seeing repeatedly in the media? Both witnesses, sorry.
Axel, would you like to go first?
Sure. I would recommend, obviously this is going to take a lot of time now. There's been 2 years worth of media publicity showing all the issues with harassment and non-inclusiveness within the CAF. I think it does, there needs to be a top-bottom approach where the top leaders, including the civilian leaders, need to take accountability and need to, force change. I think there's also like a bottom-top approach, like which, hiring practices, what kind of training is required, performance reviews. And to that, I would recommend a 360 performance review process where any kind of supervisor gains information anonymously from subordinates, fellow supervisors, and up the hierarchy, so that hopefully in the future, someone who's that problematic will not get to the high ranks of leadership and will not become this untouchable person.
My brief comment, if I could make, is I think that Canadians, parliamentarians, and CAF members need to recognize there's going to be legacy issues that are going to work their way through. We've seen that with, allegations raised against individuals that go back, decades. That is something that's going to have to be worked through because the standards were not clear, and those that were clear were not effectively enforced at all times. So I think it's important to recognize we have to take into account when things happened, what the policies were, what the approach was. And I think that it would be valuable for some technical briefings on the initiatives that are being put in place. I think several of the things that Paxton has spoken to are issues that senior leadership now have recognized and are certainly talking about and working on. And so whether that is going to get the degree of culture change in the time period that people are looking for is something that is going to be watched, I think, fairly closely.
Thank you. Mr. Okrus, you, in your first statement, I think, spoke about more family support systems presented by other countries, but you just touched on it. Could you go into more detail and provide specific examples to the committee on these family support systems?
Depending on the country, but there is more that is offered in terms of things like assisting family members with and some of the examples that I gave, securing a family doctor. So, for example, in the American system, families actually can draw on the American their military medical system for some of their services. The Australians provide some referral services so that when they change states in Australia, the family on their own don't have to go out and get on a long waiting list for family doctors, referral services and networks for spousal employment, things like even the recreation facilities that are available at bases. Again, a lot of parents struggle with getting the kids signed up for swimming lessons. So other countries provide more of those kinds of services, and they used to be available at Canadian bases and wings. Over a period of time with budget cuts, those are areas that have been cut out. And so, as I said, family housing, there's a number of areas where other countries provide supports for families that the Canadian military has had to cut back on just because there aren't the funds for it. There's more of a focus in the CAF on you're living on the economy, and to some extent you're living on your own.
And I believe actually in that set of women, we heard from women specifically reference lack of supports for housing, absolutely, and for childcare. Could you comment on that as well?
Yeah, certainly. Again, the majority of cases, childcare, and particularly, again, after-hour childcare, weekends, the kinds of childcare services that need to be provided. Again, when people get deployed, it's not like signing your kids up for the typical workday childcare system. There have been some efforts to try to provide some of that, but again, some of Canada's allies provide a lot more funding to support those because the recognition is that by supporting the family, you're actually allowing the person in uniform to do the job. You're enabling them to deploy or go away for training without causing significant tensions or pressures on the home front or causing them to have to eventually quit because they can't juggle it all. So yes, there are areas where there could be increased support for families that would have a direct consequence on retention.
Thank you, Professor Okrus. Colleagues, we've got 20 minutes and 25 minutes worth of questions. So, Mr. Motz, why don't you start us off with 4 minutes?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panelists, for being here today. Dr. Okrus, how many people seek out the Canadian Forces every year to apply as a recruit, approximately?
I'm sorry, I don't have current numbers on that. I think that would have to be a technical brief from those responsible for the recruiting system.
Okay, so we were talking about recruiting and retention. About how many of the recruits actually make it through a recruiting process? Is there a percentage that either one of you can give us, to those who apply and those who actually make it through?
So the quick comment that I would make with that one is the recruiting process is actually a layered process. And Paxton has referred to some of the, what is available when you initially, go online and look at things. There's a reason for that because the CAF needs to be able to get to a certain stage to be able to start doing things like security clearances or medicals, etc. So it's a lengthy process with multiple stages, and there are differential rates for how many men are successful versus how many women. So for example, a smaller percentage of women traditionally have made it through the system to actually get onto waiting lists and be enrolled. It's an area that the military has been looking at. The other part with this is it really depends on the occupation. There are some occupations, pilot is an obvious example. There's all sorts of people who would love to be pilots and have the organization pay for them to learn how to be a pilot. So you can be very, very competitive for the pilots, but far less competitive for other occupations that aren't high demand occupations. So it really varies across the CAF.
Sorry, Doc, for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving on. My colleague, Ms. Lampropoulos, brought this up, but do you think Canadians join Canadian forces to be peacekeepers, national security defenders, or civil domestic emergency responders? Could that be one of the reasons why we have a recruitment and retention problem? Is because people aren't signing up to be, responding to civil issues, domestic issues in our country? You touched on what the Americans have is like a National Guard. Is that something that we as a country should seriously consider so that those who want to be in our armed forces are not taken away from the armed forces' responsibilities to deal with domestic issues like National Guard, like civil emergency responders, and actually, have two separate responsibilities? And I think that has merit if I heard both of you or one of you say it earlier.
So my quick comment would be that those kinds of options have a lot more consequence in terms of internal structural decisions that are made by the military, where resources are invested, what training goes on, etc. I would suggest it would not have a huge consequence on recruiting. And partially, I'm back to the comment that I've made. A large number of people that are applying to join the military really have a limited understanding of what the military really is or does. As I said before, people join for a whole host of reasons. Typically, people are served for about 12 months to 18 months, and then they start to realize what it is that they've joined and what the options are and what the implications are. I'm not sure that they've got that fine differentiation when they're still a civilian applicant.
Okay, fair enough. I was going to ask you what the educational level is of the average recruit. The fact that they may not have properly researched it out, might limit that. One last question. I don't know how much time I have left. Perfect. What's the average recruiting time? In 2016 report that this committee did that the Auditor General did was 200 days. 200 days was the average recruiting time. What are we looking at now, Ms. Mayor or Dr. Okras?
Well, I'll have to leave that. I apologize, but we are going to.
I'm sure they'll
have
fit
to run a tight question. Well, joining the military is a little like joining politics. You don't really know what you're getting into until you're there. So. Yes, there's an amen around the corner here. Mr. Gear, welcome back to the committee. You have 4 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for making time for the committee. My first question is for Professor Okros. You've spoken a little bit about the retention rate for CAF and that it's actually better than for our NATO allies. But I'm sure there's something that they're doing better than us. What are other jurisdictions doing better than us, and what can we learn from them?
Specifically on the retention, as I said, the main one that I have, sort of focused in on is family support, because that's quite honestly is one of the primary reasons people leave earlier than they would like to leave. There's different countries have got different strategies and approaches to addressing issues. Some countries try to provide greater geographic stability, or at least keep people close to where their home is for the first few years while they make the adjustment in. it varies significantly. There's real challenges with Canada trying to follow some of those models, though, just given geographic dispersion of the calf across the size of Canada. So most of, I think, we could look at is family support would be for retention.
Great, thank you. So this question's for both witnesses. And Professor, you spoke a little bit about the advertising campaign and that videos are shown primarily during hockey matches or football games. So how is the CAF's advertising campaign and how does it fare in appealing to a broader demographic of Canada's population?
Paxton, do you want to start?
Sure. The issue is that it doesn't do a great job of appealing to a wider demographic. As Professor Akros has said, it does not do a very good job of communicating directly to niche, diverse groups within Canada. Sponsorship of certain sports, for example, baseball, where most of the demographic is older, white, and male, compared to perhaps the NBA, where at least the demographic is younger, would be more effective, for example. Moreover, I think the advertisements that are often show this very kind of exciting job position, and I think that could affect retainment, especially in that 1 to 3 year range, where people realize that it's not all helicopters all day long. There's a lot more that goes into being a CAF member.
Mike, quick, if I could follow on, the CAF has recognized these issues and has been moving particularly into social media, active on TikTok, etc. So, it has been recognizing where the right appropriate channels are to reach particularly younger people. The challenge is moving into social media to compete in that space is intensive work. Again, we're back into the challenge. They don't have the personnel to be able to put in the really intensive work that is needed to get niched messages out using these niche channels. So the CAF, I would suggest, is aware of it and is looking to try to find new approaches, but needs some assistance in terms of the resources to be able to do so.
Great, thank you. So that was actually my next question regarding social media and digital recruitment technologies. So Professor, you've spoken about it, but Ms. Mayer, if you want to comment on that?
On their use of social media?
Yeah.
They are on TikTok, they're on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram as well, and they are showing more, dedicated advertisements towards the younger demographic, especially, and more diverse demographics. But I would echo that it's a resourcing issue at this point. It's very difficult to compete on digital markets like this with maybe only 1 or 2 social media personnel.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Madame Normandin, 1.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. To recruit and retain better, I imagine that we need to really know what the issues are, but there seems to be a code of silence in the armed forces, so it's really hard to get specific information from members of the armed forces to get them to open up about the real problems, because there's the image, which doesn't always, or the ads, which don't always reflect what's really happening within the forces. So do you think that we need to get past this, the law of silence within the forces to find out what the real issues are?
Go, Paxton.
Yes, absolutely. The code of silence is it's acting negatively for the CAF at this point, not perhaps positively where it's intended. I would recommend doing exit interviews, for example, or exit surveys for CAF members who are exiting out of the first basic training all the way to CAF members who are exiting after 20 years in the service. And within that interview within that survey, I would try to break down that code of silence by asking specific questions. Did you feel supported from a medical standpoint? Were you matched with a medical professional? Did you have childcare? To make these surveys and interviews easy to complete, and also try to make them as mandatory as possible.
quick observation. I would suggest the committee may benefit from a technical brief on the research that is done in the surveys that are currently being administered and the data collected. Some of this, I think, is available. So senior leaders are collecting this information and being briefed on it.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave that question there. I'm sure you'll work it back in, Professor Arkros. Madame Masson, a minute and a half, please.
There used to be bigger recruitment budgets, certainly within the armed forces, and you were speaking about going to people where people are, younger people, in terms of social media. But it used to be that the armed forces actually would send recruiters into rural, remote communities, northern communities, indigenous communities, and that doesn't seem to happen as much. Would that be like a return to that kind of recruitment in terms of First Nations communities? Would that be something that the armed forces should look at?
So my quick comment would be yes, and as you've identified, the issue again is back to resource decisions that had to be taken at certain stages. There are significant challenges with the distribution of the force structure. How many people do you want to have that are actually, deploying and doing operations versus how many people do you want to have in the recruiting, the training system, et cetera? Those are constant decisions that the senior leadership need to make, which is where I made my comment about either they need increased predictability so they can allocate the resources in the right spaces, or we need to fund flexibility because they've not had flexibility, and that's what's been a detriment to recruiting processes.
We have 12 seconds. Mr. Dowdell, 4 minutes, please. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers here for taking time out of their schedule. I was fortunate enough, my prior life before being an MP, I was the mayor of Essa Township, which has the largest training base on it, which is a base Borden. So a lot of the military go through there all the time. And I can tell you one of the comments that I heard earlier, which was important, is I guess for the lifestyle that especially now, it's changed over the years. They used to live on the base, and now they live in the community. It's not so much the same as it was years ago. So they actually increased the wages at one point in time, and they could buy houses in our town. And now the problem is the average home is $800,000. So I'm just wondering if people are looking into that when they're deciding to join the military. And it's certainly, like I said, the spouse, the importance they're getting involved in sports, they're teaching our kids hockey, all the events. They're part of our community now. It's really changed. I'm just wondering if that's part of the reason that we're not maybe getting some more applications.
Sorry, go ahead, Paxton.
I was going to make a quick comment on the salary issue and housing issue that would lead to it. Currently, there's just one page on the CAF website for salaries stating that your starting salary would be anywhere from around, I believe, $33,000 to around $64,000. And that's all the information that's provided. So yes, I definitely think that more information on salary needs to be provided so that applicants feel comfortable that they could afford a house in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. And then one more comment. I was fortunate enough as well in the prior sitting to actually be on this committee, and I was part of the study that we did into the sexual misconduct in the military. And I don't know if you had an opportunity to witness or to see any of that. I can tell you, as an MP in a riding with a base, the amount of filibustering by the government during that period of time when we had people there that had testimony, and to not come to conclusion for me was actually certainly disappointing. And I just want to simply, do you think that committee helped in any way to increase the numbers that might want to join today?
I believe that committee showed that members of parliament do take this issue seriously, even if some of the members who were witnessing were not taking it as seriously or didn't provide as much accountability as hoped. I do have to say, personally watching it, it did not increase my comfort with the sexual harassment that was occurring in the CAF, as like no accountability was really taken at all, actually, over multiple meetings. And perhaps this could be a recommendation for government, is to write policies for, what, when this happens, what do civilian oversight, what do parliamentarians do? And maybe that would remove some of the political influence from that and make it more of a standard formal policy.
My quick comment that I'd make, I think those that watch committee hearings on a regular basis are quite capable of watching political theater and recognizing it and recognizing all of the different parties and how they contributed to it.
Okay, and then
have 30 seconds.
Okay, just quickly, do you think the lack of infrastructure that we have too, perhaps would be another thought process that maybe people don't want to get involved? I used to get people picketing my offices, for instance, that they were against perhaps purchasing some equipment for the military. That's changed, certainly since the invasion. It seems to be going a different way. But do you think that might hinder people that are learn something in there and maybe go somewhere else after?
Leave the response to that question, which is an important question, to another issue. Maybe our final 4 minutes goes to Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here. Quickly, I wanted to ask Dr. Okros, you talked about an example out of the UK that was doing it well in terms of the family kind of unit and supports there. Is there another jurisdiction, or maybe it is the UK, that you think is doing it well that Canada should look to kind of overall on recruitment and retention issues? I think the kind of ultra masculine approach to armed forces is not unique to Canada, and sexual misconduct issues. My background, you worked in the US a little bit on the don't ask, don't tell policies. So, this is not unique, but it is certainly a highly macho kind of industry in how you break down not only the stereotypes, but also the reality of what's actually happening and the systemic issues. Are there jurisdictions who kind of acknowledged the damage that this has done and have made significant progress, or have done really strategic things that either of you could point to, that you think has, because this is going to take a while to really flow through the system, but is there a jurisdiction that we could look to that you think has done a lot of positives in this regard?
Two quick ones, if I could. One on the retention, and we mentioned the issue of housing. I would look at the Australians and their policies on housing. That's one place I'd look at. The second thing on the sexual harassment issue, certainly the Five Eyes are all looking at the same issues at the same time. And the general consensus from the other countries is Canada is leading. Canada has been more willing to be open about it, to challenge it, to question it. And the strategy that have been put forward over the last year, some that Paxton has spoken to, like new policy announcements on the importance of inclusion, the importance of character, the areas that senior leaders are talking about of where the CAF is going to go. They're leading, the Canadian Armed Forces is leading the Five Eyes. They're all watching to see how these things work.
Ms. Mayu, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I think that's
okay. Fair enough. I wanted to touch on something in terms of recruitment as well. In terms of cultural experiences, I've said this before in this committee, so my colleagues might have already heard this, but I was in municipal politics before. We had a very similar new firefighters, new police officers that match the diversity of our community, because a lot of new Canadians, certainly their parents at least, saw some of these institutions as not good places to be, not institutions they think their children should be in. I could imagine in some cultures and some countries of Canadians that are now here, itself comes with significant challenges. Is there anything being done or jurisdictions to kind of break down that misperception about the value of joining CAF in this example?
So just briefly, it's recognized and acknowledged, and yes, there are efforts, but it's a bit of why I made my comment about it. It really requires niche communications into specific communities, because there's different reasons why members of some communities are reluctant to join the military. And again, we're back into this requires time and effort and money, and most importantly, people. And that's why not as much of it has been done as should be.
Ms. Paxton, would you like to just finish us off with a brief statement?
Brief statement towards that question?
Yes.
Yes. So I would just, yes, we need resources to, really discuss and communicate with these communities. But again, I think the organizational change that needs to happen will impact this as well, because even if you are looking forward to working for the CAF someday, if you're hearing about all the harassment towards visible minorities, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, women, that's definitely going to deter you as well.
Thank you.
Before I suspend, I just want to thank, on behalf of the committee, both Ms. Meyer and Professor Okros. You've certainly launched our study in a very positive direction and very useful, and thank you for your thoughtful comments. So with that, colleagues, we'll suspend while we re-empanel. Paneled, and we welcome for our second hour Andrea Lane, Defense Scientist, Defense Research and Development Canada, Centre for Operational Research and Analysis, and Madeleine Nicole Maliette. I would now invite both of you for your 5-minute statements, starting with you, Ms. Lane.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. I am a defense scientist, but I am appearing as an individual. And as such, I'm not really able to comment directly on current policy, except as it intersects with my research. And I'm also a proud Navy wife. If I could begin with what I feel is the key factor in making recruitment and retention in the CAF so challenging, it is that there is no CAF culture. There is instead 1,000 different microcultures within the CAF. Every service, every occupation has a particular set of traditions, requirements, habits, and vocabularies that are specific to it, and often at odds with other occupations. A recruiting campaign that attracts someone to a very physical, aggressive, and identity-based occupation like infanteer might actively discourage someone who is interested in becoming a search and rescue technician. Figuring out what universal patterns of behavior are harmful, like heavy drinking or sexual harassment, that's the easy part. Understanding how things like traditional but untested requirements for upper body strength to access certain occupations, how those requirements potentially discriminate against women, is more complex and requires sensitive research and unit level solutions. This brings me to the second challenge, the tension between individuality and universality. In seeking to make the CAF more welcoming for people who don't fit the traditional mold of rural, old stock Canadian man with a stay-at-home wife, the CAF has instituted policies around dress and grooming, parental leave, postings, service couples, etc., that are designed to support CAF members with differing personal and family needs. Unfortunately, these policies that benefit some members are perceived by others as disadvantaging them, or as weakening a foundational aspect of military culture, universality of service, which is sometimes voiced as a soldier is a soldier is a soldier. And even when leaders recognize that universality has always been code for white, Anglophone, and male, there is a very real concern that beyond a certain point, individual accommodations destroy the esprit de corps that for some members is at the core of their military service. This is seen as a cultural shift, but it is more accurately an economic transition. In previous decades, Canadians joining the CAF accepted a loss of autonomy for the protection of a career that could support a family on one income, where you moved frequently, but housing was available and subsidized, where your kids moved from school to school, but would meet old friends on base schools around the world. Now the situation is dramatically different. Most families are dual income by choice or necessity, and many CAF bases are located in places where it is difficult for spouses to find meaningful and gainful employment. Housing costs have skyrocketed, and CAF members who move frequently are at the mercy of the market, while others who stay in one place are making large profits. The perks of CAF service no longer outweigh the loss of autonomy and the severe family strain it can create. And policies to support individuality can only go so far when the CAF is facing structural economic problems that are rooted in Canadian society writ large. Finally, the third challenge, evidence. We know from prior research that women and other minorities face a wide range of barriers in mostly white, mostly male institutions like the CAF. But what we don't know is how to fix it in the specific context of the military. For example, if women are perceived as bossy or shrill or unlikable when they are assertive, this can make them a less effective leader. How do you tease out the effects of sexism from the reality of the fact that most women in the CAF will lead men for the bulk of their career? How do you distinguish a woman who is a poor leader from a woman who is experiencing the corrosive effects of sexism for her subordinates? Every CAF advancement decision is noticed, discussed, dissected on social media, and the subject of rumor and grievance. So being transparent about what is happening when people are promoted or not is key. When it comes to culture change, we don't know what best practices look like because war is a very difficult experimental condition to replicate. Every researcher and policymaker who wants to change the bad aspects of CAF culture, sexism, sexual misconduct, racism, homophobia, groupthink, anti-intellectualism, and cronyism, runs into the same argument. Hey, this is what has worked in the past. How do I know your suggestions aren't going to get people killed? And the truthful answer is, I don't know. But what I do know is that the CAF is desperately short of people. The sexual misconduct scandals have broken Canadians' trust in their military, as well as CAF members' trust in their leadership. As Canadian society becomes more polarized and trust in institutions declines even further, the CAF must adapt to survive. And one way it can adapt is by careful, evidence-based, and transparent changes in culture, training, and advancement. Thank you, and I welcome your questions on anything that I presented or another aspect of recruitment, retention, and culture change.
Thank you, Ms. Lane. Ms. Mayette, 5 minutes, please.
I would like to thank this panel to allow me to be the voice of 200 plus active soldiers. While talking with other veterans, I became aware of an increasing number of conversations in regard to the radicalization towards violent extremism within our Canadian military. I therefore met with privates, corporals, and master corporals in the regular forces and asked 2 questions. If you are working in a known hostile environment, what keeps you there? What behaviors do you consider hostile? Since August 2021, I received close to 200 reported instances of hostile behaviors, which is added to my own experience at CFB Borden. I actually witnessed the belittling of lower ranked soldiers outside military places. This situation not only affects the retention of our military personnel, it can also push members into violent outbursts or the acceptance that abuse is part of the training. These are some of my findings. First, the lack of immediate response by a higher ranking officer witnessing any inappropriate comments made by middle ranking officers towards lower ranking soldiers is simply sending a message to both parties that this unprofessional behavior is considered acceptable. For example, comments like, in regard to the institution housing problem, have you thought about letting go of your sole custody arrangement? This would make it easier for you to find a place to live. In regard to jokes, are you turning native on me? Or, well, I hope we will not discover unmarked graves on our base. In regard to promotion, this is racism because you are only promoted because you are a woman, gay, or a minority. In regard to attending family funerals, well, this person is not important enough for me to give you the bereavement time you need. The data indicates that not one commissioned officer who heard those comments even acknowledged how inappropriate they were. This lack of immediate response ends up sending a message to the military that the military have full control over a soldier's family, right to grieve a family member, and a person's racial identity. Second, within the past 2 years, a few master corporals have identified moral issues within their own squadron or division. Out of their own goodwill, they contacted commissioned officer in order to present solutions to these problems. In response to their inputs, these master corporals were threatened with a charge of sedition and treason, in particular if they persisted into bringing forth those problems. Fear of repercussion is found in all correspondence I receive. It takes an incredible amount of courage to talk to anyone in or outside the military. A code of silence is imposed on all soldiers within our national defense. Control through fear is found in 100% of my collected data. Third, the obvious change in military hierarchy can be identified by its previous pyramidal form to the ballooning distribution of ranks. The change in ratio upper ranks to lower ranks is causing fierce competitions between peers, in particular when promotion is at play. Micromanagement becomes far more obvious because it includes microaggression comments, lack of proper job distribution, belittling and ostracizing behaviors, and willful ignorance of unbecoming behaviors. Micromanagement is also conducive to the development of toxic environments. The DND grievance process is inadequate. Having had a conversation with individuals working in that department, I realized that the majority of complaints are seen as useless, unfounded, and are simply categorized as a human rights issue, which means that a soldier's grievance is simply ignored. Therefore, the same soldier is now obligated to finance his or her own grievance. Fifth, the medical department is fully aware of the location of these known toxic environments. They have acknowledged to many of my contacts that they are aware of departments causing mental health issues. However, since they do not have any power over other military sections, their solution is to medicate individuals who have no other choices but to return to these same toxic work environment. This is an internal threat to the safety of our public, because some individuals told me that they have advised their supervisor that they had not adapted to the new medication and would need some time to adjust. They were refused the right to go on sick leave. The feeling of anxiety associated to their inability to fully concentrate on a job increased the level of fear associated to causing the death of a coworker.
Ms. Maya, could you, sorry to interrupt you, but could you wind it up as soon as possible, please.
Okay, in conclusion, retention is only successful when toxic behaviors are under control. It is also important to understand toxicity induces a radicalization towards violent extremism.
Thank you. Mr. Motz, start your 6 minutes rounds.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for being here. You're both very uniquely, I guess, have a very unique perspective, if you will, from the Canadian Armed Forces, both as being serving in it and having a family member in the Canadian Forces. And so I want to ask you a couple questions. I'll start with you first, Ms. Lane. If your husband, you said, is a Navy officer right now, he's in the Navy, would he do it again? Would you want him to do it again if he had a choice to start over, given the current environment of the military?
I hesitate to speak for him, but
oh yes,
I think
know.
He would.
Okay.
I do think he would. He's had a very fulfilling career in spite of the ups and downs.
Would you want
would
him
I
to?
Want him? I think I would as well.
Okay.
Although I would acknowledge that it's been difficult, not only it's had impact on my career, but on our kids' lives. But there's something to be said for seeing your spouse be satisfied and happy in their work. And for him, that's been in the Navy. I don't think it's the only place he'd be happy, but if he told me I wish to do it all over again, I would support him.
Thank you. Ms. Mayette, you have served, and thank you for your service. You have served, if you were to do it, if you were to start 1980 over again in 2022, would you do that?
In 2022, no, I would not.
And why is that?
Because of my contact with soldiers right now, and I see how more toxic the environment is now compared to when I was serving.
Well, I mean, this, we've certainly been aware as a country of some of the challenges that exist within the military. And, this committee, we were remarking on the break about, this committee is great in that we have a common goal and a common interest, and that is Canada's national security, the ability for our military to defend our country and to have the tools necessary to do so, retain and recruit people and fix the challenges that exist in it. So together as a group, we have recommendations that have been made in the past, some of them about over the years, whether it be in the last 6 years or even the last 10 or 15 years. There's areas in the military that have to be fixed. So what do we need to do? I mean, to answer both your questions, I mean, one is coming from your perspective, Ms. Mayette, and one is coming from yours. I mean, I guess, Ms. Lane, I could ask you the same question. If you were, you were a reservist, would you want to now join the military as a regular member in 2022?
Oh, yes, I was briefly in the reserves in the UK. I personally wouldn't wish to join currently, but I welcome your questions that relate more to my professional research as well. But
that's my point. My point is that our role here is to try and better our military, find out why people aren't staying in the military, to find out why we can't recruit people appropriately, why we're at least 7,500 or I've heard numbers up to 10,000 short across the board with respect to CAF and the Navy and Air Force, etc. We have challenges with the misconducts that have been going on. How do we fix it? You're academics, both of you. You've done research, both of you. How do we fix what's broken in a way that continues to serve those who serve our country honorably, and deals with those that may not have been?
Can I answer this one?
You can both answer.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I am a quantitative researcher. Okay. I always look for data that shows me something I'm not expecting. What I would do right now is actually get the clearance to enter any medical documentation and figure out where the toxic environments actually are. By knowing the amount of soldiers who are medicated and operating their medication, it would give an idea of where actually the toxic environments are and which squadron, which division, and how does it, then you have a better idea where to start.
Okay, Ms. Lane?
I think my answer would be slightly different, and that would be to start with a conversation to have with Canadians as a whole about what do we see as the role of the Canadian Armed Forces going forward, and how do we adapt that to what we foresee as Canadian society going forward. Many of the challenges that the CAF faces currently, and as you say, have faced for 15, 20 years, are related to challenges that the Canada as a whole faces in terms of who are we as a country, who do we see as our allies, what do we see as our history, and what do we see as our future. And for many Canadians, that has been in flux quite a bit. We saw the disruptive influences of the Trump presidency in the United States in terms of how Canadians viewed that traditionally very allied relationship with the US. The invasion of Ukraine now, I think, we see it in Germany's foreign policy posture has changed. And I think many in Canada are sort of reevaluating that safety and peacefulness that we have largely felt since the end of the Cold War.
Unfortunately,
and the CAF is an important part of that.
Unfortunately, Mr. Motz hasn't left you enough time to really expand your thoughts on that important question. Mr. May, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to both of you for being here to kick off this study. My questions will be to Andrea Lane, and I will keep my questions to your specific research. You've written about the gendering of the armed forces, and particularly the combat focused roles, and the popularly accepted link between masculinity and soldiering. You've also noted the link between the need to reinforce the masculinity of soldiering with the reinforcement of the most negative aspects of masculinity, what we would now refer to perhaps as toxic masculinity. How does this influence the issues we are seeing in the forces, including sexual misconduct and various forms of discrimination?
Thank you for that question, and I will do my best to answer it, although the caveat is it's extremely complex. And I should note that there's a distinction between what you correctly identified as toxic masculinity and masculinity more general, and also between toxic masculinity and men. So some effects of the gender culture of the CAF are simply because there are a lot of men in the CAF, and it's an institution which has traditionally been built around men, and some of those effects are neutral or even beneficial. As a woman who works in the defense communities, I sometimes joke that aside from having to listen to about sports all the time, the negative masculine characteristics of my workday are not that extreme. But it's that particular linkage between a very physical idea of what it is to become a man, that sort of toughness, the aggression that is sometimes cultured even in Canadian society, but particularly in military training. There is an aspect of dominance and sometimes even sexual dominance that can be built into those narratives, even unwittingly. And we see it in popular culture as well. The hero of a movie about war is often a hit with the ladies, for example. Well, if you don't think about that critically, you don't realize that, what is the plot line of the romance in the movie? Can we recognize the fact that it's extremely heteronormative, that we associate masculinity with heterosexual sexual prowess and that kind of thing? So it's very difficult to untangle the sort of positive or neutral aspects of masculinity and men from toxic masculinity and how it affects sexual harassment in the military, because what we're essentially getting at is the core identity of people who serve. There's a proud tradition of being extremely fit and extremely resilient physically, especially within the Army Combat Arms. it's very hard to say, some of that swagger or braggadocio is harmful to your female colleagues because they feel excluded from it or they feel threatened by it, without also threatening the core of what it can mean for those men to be men and to be soldiers. And I think societally, we do a very bad job of explaining what positive masculinity looks like, or even discussing positive masculinity. And so sometimes I've heard from my CAF colleagues, okay, well, like, I don't grope women and I don't make sexist jokes, but am I toxic? Like, am I a toxic masculine person simply by virtue of being a man in the military? And of course, the answer is no, but it's very difficult to discuss something as severe as sexual harassment and sexual misconduct without making it about individuals almost unintentionally. I don't know if I've answered your question. I'm sorry.
That's great. No, it's fantastic. I was going to jump in. I thought, what, hearing from you on this, it makes a lot more sense than hearing from me, to be quite honest. You talked in your opening remarks about culture, and I think rightfully that it's not as simple as one culture, that there's multiple cultures. So I preface with this next question with that. How could culture change efforts improve the ability of women and diverse groups to succeed in combat roles? For instance, by creating an environment where people are assessed solely on their ability to do the tasks of a soldier and not on their ability to conform to a traditional masculine gender.
So, as a researcher, of course, I'm going to say we need more research, but the answer is actually to figure out which parts of traditional aspects of physical tests to differentiate between the combat roles are necessary, and which are kind of left over from a more traditional military evaluation of what it means to be a soldier. So there are definitely baseline fitness aspects to jobs like being in the infantry or being in the Army Combat Arms. And there's no way of getting around that. There are, you have to be able to lift things over your head and all sorts of other things that can be challenging for some women to achieve. But the difference is not every requirement has been fully evaluated as being necessary. And so to know which parts of traditional soldiering are necessary and which parts of traditional soldiering are just kind of traditional, that requires pretty honest research. Honest because sometimes the answer to those questions disappoints people like me who are strong advocates for women in combat arms, for example. Like if the research tells me that actually being able to lift 65 pounds over my head is a requirement for the job, I'm not necessarily going to like that answer. But I think for the research to be genuine and for it to treat people in the military with fairness, we have to be ready to find out things that we don't necessarily want to find out as advocates and researchers.
We're going to have to, unfortunately, leave the answer there.
Thank you.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our two witnesses for your opening statements. I have a question for Madame Mayette. We're talking about cultural change in the armed forces. That might take time, but in the short term, is there anything you heard when you spoke with people that can help to improve the culture in the short term? Yes. For when it comes to retention, there is the posted living differential, which has been cancelled. And since 2009, the forces haven't looked at bringing that back. But I think we should bring it back because it has to do with compensation for privates and master corporals. Of course, PMQs are also very important on military bases. There should be small modular homes or trailers or some kind of living spaces. There's also the matter of posting elsewhere. People today need 2 salaries to live a decent life. Families need to be supported more. A soldier starts at the bottom of the ladder, And when a soldier takes training and classes on a military base, the soldier has to pay for housing and food. So on top of paying for the apartment the person left behind, when you're getting $700 a month, it doesn't leave much for paying for your first, for your original apartment, and then for being away on training as well. You talked about the impact of this kind of life on the family. I'd like to know whether there's been a change in the way families are being treated within the armed forces, or have things stayed the same over many years? Well, in fact, Dr. Okros talked about this. When I was in the armed forces, there was help and support for families. And when a family had to move, well, somebody looked after the family during the move. But you see this less and less because now a soldier is being transferred and not the entire family. So yes, since 1980, there have been changes. Thank you. Now, when it comes to changing the culture in the armed forces, you're a researcher. The other witness is a researcher. So clearly you're able to zoom in on the problems and you try to find the answers. So I'd like to know how hard it is for researchers to really understand what these specific problems are within the armed forces. What more can you tell us? Well, the first problem is the military clearance. So a person with academic credentials will have a top secret clearance, and that person will have more access to data, to information. And so a lot of people don't have top security or top military clearance, so they don't have access to a lot of information. Second, whether you have an officer or a non-commissioned officer, during basic training, they are told to never speak back to a person who is higher ranking within the military hierarchy. So if a researcher tries to ask questions of an academic, so anyone with academic credentials is perceived as being an officer. So the answers given will not contradict what the researcher is asking. So we don't really get the answers we're looking for. We don't really get the truth because in basic training, you learn to never contradict anyone who has a higher rank than you. Studies have been carried out on the toxic work environment in the armed forces. Do you know who conducted those studies and who exactly was interviewed? As far as I understand, yes, there have been several studies on toxic work environments, and these different studies were carried out by different officers. So when an officer conducts research, well, the person who answers will give the researcher, who's an officer, what the officer wants to hear. So certainly there has been all kinds of research. Some of this research has yielded valid data, but often it's just superficial data. If you want to dig a little, you need to find informants, if I can put it that way, and then you need to be able to access the data revealed by the so-called informant. Now, to get those so-called informants, what do you need to do to find them so we can get a better idea of what's actually happening on the ground? Well, as far as I'm concerned, if I want to get better answers, more reliable answers, I'll go see a master corporal who will ask questions of master corporals and corporals. So let's stay with that group. And that group will give much more reliable answers. What about sergeants and higher ranking officers? If I ask them questions and officers, I usually get reliable answers. Ms. Matheson.
Thank you. so in the previous panel, one of the witnesses had talked about exit interviews and performing those. And so, Madame Mayette, you were talking about that data. So without the influence of active armed forces members, being active so that they were already out of the system, would that provide you with better data because they wouldn't be held to that don't contradict a higher ranked officer? Is that what I could get from that?
Can I tell you personal, whether
Absolutely.
I want it or not? Okay, that contradiction is it's ingrained in me, and I am terrified of contradicting somebody I perceive that would have a higher rank than mine.
Even
and
after
I've been
service?
away, and after service.
Okay. So okay, understood. Can you explain for both witnesses, I suppose, just about housing, right? So we also heard and have heard a lot about that infrastructure that's required, the supports that are required in terms of the cost of housing and the provision that used to exist with housing. We also heard about childcare. I've heard about that from particularly officers' parents who are serving, but a lot of people, I think, believe that housing is provided on base. There was a provision of barracks. So what used to exist, maybe how that's changed when it changed?
I can answer that one for CFB Borden.
Okay.
Okay. CFB Borden have destroyed a tremendous amount of old PMQs, okay, within the last 10 to 15 years. That is actually causing a housing problem for the soldiers. The infrastructures or like the water and the sanitary system still in place, the house are not there anymore. So it would take nothing to put trailers there or to put mini homes there.
One of the fundamental issues is that has been a change in the way that the housing provided by the military, when it is provided, is regarded as a taxable benefit now under Treasury Board rules. So previously, the CAF was able to provide subsidized housing with a subsidy, but that was deemed a taxable benefit, which meant that CAF housing had to be offered at market rates. And you can imagine that, as with any institutional landlord, it's very hard to maintain your housing stock at market rates such that families want to live in them. The other change has been the way that people's expectations around what family living has looked like. So I live in a house that was built in the early 1970s, as some CAF PMQs were. It's considered sort of quaintly small by most of my friends who live further out of town in larger, more modern houses. So part of what's happening is an economic thing to around taxation, and part of it is around people's expectations around what housing looks like.
I certainly know what that's about. We have a lot of that sort of barracks, smaller individual homes in London where we used to have Wolseley Barracks, and so I can picture that exactly. Having sat on Status of Women, where we published a report on sexual misconduct in the military, a lot of witnesses spoke about women leaving and, of course, not joining in the first place in terms of the CAF. But one of the recommendations from the report was that the Government of Canada publish a strategy with clear performance metrics to attract, promote, and retain women and other minorities in the Canadian Armed Forces. That included comparative metrics around the numbers of women and minorities by trade, classification and rank, length of time of service and rank, those command positions, length of all that service. So do you support that recommendation of that consistent reporting, and then, of course, that reporting being reported to Parliament?
This is veering into current policy. I can speak as a researcher on this kind of issue. More data is always better, and disaggregated data is the gold standard. So, knowing why it is that women pilots above the rank of lieutenant, or sorry, that's a Navy rank, but above the rank of brigadier general, for example, are leaving the forces, versus knowing why male privates with a Pakistani background are leaving. Those are important data points. And whether or not we understand what we're seeing in a 1 year to 5 year timeline, when you start to be able to see trends from the disaggregated data, then it allows you to really know what is going on. There was your colleague, Madame Normandin, asked a question about what are the challenges of collecting this research. And one of the challenges is that, particularly around sexual misconduct, if you ask 15 women how to make their time in the CAF better, you will get 15 different answers, and all of them are valid and all of them have policy recommendations attached to them. But often those recommendations are at complete odds and ends with each other. And so it's very difficult to take really personal information about people's experiences and fears and hopes and make policy recommendations for that, because you'll have just as many people who say, that is the last thing that I want.
And Madam, I was nodding, so I assume she agreed with that.
Okay, well, that's good. Then we don't have to ask her again. Okay. Colleagues, again, the chair is in the same dilemma, which is we've got 25 minutes worth of questions to be done in 20 minutes. So if we do our 5-minute rounds becomes 4 minutes, 4, 4, 1, 1, 4, 4, maybe we'll get through it. Mr. Dowdell, 4 minutes, please.
Okay, I just want to take an opportunity to thank our presenters today, and maybe get back, I guess, to my colleague's question. I don't know if you're on the first part. I actually, Base Borden is within my riding, and I was the mayor there, so we worked often together. A lot of times with the base commander on social issues that we would make the spouse. Like I said, we implemented a bus system that ran to the city because a lot of them could only afford one car, perhaps, and getting jobs. I heard that earlier, how it can be difficult to get employment in the area. So when you get back to the housing, and I said this in the last one, and the cost of the housing, I think we're way behind already, and we have these concerns. I said on the last one, I'm just wondering what concrete things should we do now that is actually going to change, that is attainable without great debate, whether it's politically or whatever it might be, that we could actually do to hopefully change some of these things that are going on there, and that might help us, not from the people that are in there that are frustrated, that are part of the organization now, and even veterans before, like a lot of them they're facing some tough times out there. So I'm just wondering, what can we do really right now that could be like the low hanging fruit that we could just get ahead of the game?
Can I speak for the soldiers, what they asked for? What the soldiers spoke to me, asked for, is a review and reinstating of the posted living differential. That would help right now. And that's 200 plus soldiers are saying that.
Okay, did you have anything to add, Ms. Lane?
Yeah, so the difficulty with the post-living differential is that the base rate is Ottawa. And I think any of us who are experienced with the Ottawa real estate market know that it's experienced a tremendous growth just in the past couple of years. So everything being tied to living in Ottawa doesn't actually address the cost of living in Ottawa. And I have heard that people are reluctant to take postings to the HQs and other establishments in Ottawa because of, if you're moving from Wainwright, or you're moving from Petawawa, or you're moving from Oromocto, for example, the cost, the money you're getting from selling your house there does not come close to getting you a house in Ottawa. So as to what the solution is, it's complicated. And the one thing that I think is important to note is that as many people who are losing on the real estate market, they all know colleagues and friends who are winning. And that disparity in whether or not your family's move has resulted in a financial loss, and hearing about somebody whose family's move has resulted in them earning $300,000 that you didn't, that actually sets up people for a tremendous amount of grievance even within the service. So it's certainly a retention issue, but I think it's a morale issue as well. And I'm afraid I don't have a solution for that.
Okay. How am I for time, Mr.
A minute.
Chair?
A little less than a minute.
Okay, so I guess one other question that I would have when we talk about recruiting people, do you think we're doing enough, perhaps educationally, with parents in communities to understand what it means to be part of the CAF, and are we starting early enough probably like in the schools, and really showing and showcasing different aspects and different careers that can come out of it.
Very briefly.
In the UK, they do have more interaction with the schools, but I should note that across the country, you will get very many visceral reactions, either positive or negative, to the idea that the military will be involved in your schools. And you should probably recognize that there's no national answer. The uptake for that and the desire to have that sort of reach by the military varies quite dramatically region to region and is potentially a national unity issue. So yes, there are other countries who do it. I'm not sure that I would recommend it as a Canadian solution particularly.
Thank you, Mr. Dowdell. Mr. Fisher, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Lane, you've said numerous times this is complex and this is complicated, and I certainly appreciate that. And your comment about ask 15 people 15 different exit questions, you get 15 different answers, it speaks volumes to the complexity to all of this. Ms. Lane, I'd like to talk about universality of service, or more specifically, maybe the modernization of universality of service. What do our allies, what does NATO, do they have a more stringent, more rigid universality of service? Is that something that has positively impacted their retention and recruitment in other countries?
I'm not familiar enough with NATO countries more broadly. I can speak to a couple of countries who have invested in this differently and in the context of their military service. So, for example, Israel has a program in which they have required military service. So because they have the responsibility to accept basically all citizens, they have established military service for people who are neurodivergent, for example, on the autistic spectrum, and have found a way to have meaningful involvement by neurodivergent people within their military. In the United States, there is more concern with injured veterans, particularly from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And in the same way that Canada has a few ways that people who have been injured can continue to serve, I think that's really the best way of thinking about how do we expand those exemptions, particularly when we start looking at recruiting people in non-traditional occupations like cyber operator. Is there a way of thinking about the way that we connect promotion to supervising, that perhaps we could look at disentangling those so that people could maintain their one job without having to necessarily advance in a way that is traditionally viewed as military, for example, taking on supervisory, but instead kind of stay with their preferred cyber job at their computer or whatever. And I'm sorry, I'm simplifying that a little bit, but there certainly are other countries that have expanded the definition of what it means to be able to serve. And oftentimes that is rooted in more of the national service or semi-conscripted version of what military service is.
And certainly with 100 some types of jobs, and a willingness or a need for us to have more diverse Canadians and perhaps members of the disability community participating in our military. I think it's something so you would suggest that that's possibly a way forward?
I think so, and again, I think my colleague Dr. Okros, noted that if you have people who can't, for example, deploy, then you are sort of taking billets from people who can deploy, who might need for family reasons to have a rotation at home that they're not at sea, for example. So, all of these things are good ideas in principle, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but the sort of second and third order effects at what it means to have a population within the CAF who can only live in Toronto, for example, and can't be posted to, I hate to pick on Wainwright, but it's top of mind, Wainwright or Oromocto. There are all sorts of other kind of follow-on effects that need to be examined before any of these are taken in. But I think, for example, beta testing, having people with various cognitive or physical disabilities join the CAF as a test program could be a way forward potentially.
I'm sorry to say, Mr. Fisher, his time is up. He's down to 1 second. Yeah, I know. Those are great questions, too. Yeah, but Madame Normandine will demonstrate to all of you how you can ask a question in 1 minute and elicit amazing information. 1 minute.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We know that some soldiers, when they leave the armed forces, they end up in the public service or paramilitary organizations. Does this have any repercussions on these new working environments, this toxic environment? Does it transfer? I imagine the question is for me? Yes, of course. Well, I cannot speak on behalf of my work, and I'm not even allowed to say where I work or what I do, but I can say that yes, I can say yes in response, because the positions where you have a certain amount of authority will attract retired officers. So we're starting to see that the military culture is starting to bleed into the public service. We're starting to see it. The code of silence, for example, is starting to be noticed. But I'm not allowed to speak about it because I've been forbidden.
Madame Matheson, 1 minute. It's a challenge.
I don't know if I'm going to meet it. Ms. Lane, you were talking about those countries that had required service. Is it? And I sort of think about the idea that the military is one long career and only one. I often heard that there were a lot of companies that were trying to reach out in terms of the military to show that progression of what service could mean, and so what's being trained, how that leads into a different career in terms of different stages. In terms of that private sector grouping, is that something that the Canadian government should focus more on?
In terms of, doing more to support veterans transitions, yes, I think there are quite a few initiatives already, and particularly in the public service where I work now, there is a veterans hiring priority. I think more could be done perhaps to make people within the private service more aware of the skills that people in the CAF can bring. But honestly, I think former service people are the best spokespeople themselves. And often you'll have those individual networks that have been created by people who have retired from the CAF and so-and-so got hired and you join them. And it's not as if people who have retired from the CAF are kind of need help themselves in developing those skills so much as perhaps civilians need to be more familiar with what those skills are. And that's more broadly, Canadians don't know that much about their military in general.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that is very true. Madame Finley, 4 minutes, please.
I'm not sure which one of you can answer this, but what is the education level of the average recruit? Do you know?
According to the 200 individual who answered, most of them have finished high school, okay, which is different than what we had before. And a lot of them has a first-year college or a first-year university.
And do you know what portion of the recruits are male or female?
It's equal, male and female.
And do you know what portion are Indigenous of recruits?
No, I'm sorry, that I cannot answer.
In your opinions, do you think Canadians join the Canadian Forces to be peacekeepers and to fight if necessary, or to fight climate change?
Okay, the people that I talk to are looking to be peacekeepers. When it comes to climate change, yes, if it can help someone, they will. But if it doesn't, no, they won't. They would rather be peacekeepers.
And they don't have specialized training on climate change, is that correct? I mean, when they are deployed for those services, I'm told that often they end up just kind of keeping things in order because they don't actually have training in firefighting, say, or flood control specifically. Is that correct?
I'm sorry on that one. I could not answer. I don't know.
Okay. What kind of inducements are available and do you think should be available to get people to join the Canadian Forces? Maybe better support for families sounds like would be one of them.
That is one of them. And also changing the way that the instruction given to the soldier is recognized in certain academic function. In certain areas, it's not recognized at all. And that is causing a problem for some soldiers to advance in academia.
But for some people in service, they actually, I've seen many who have obtained a high level of education through the support of the armed forces. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that is correct. However, some of the instruction that they get into the military training are simply not recognized in the public service sometimes.
I was a little disturbed by your testimony. You said that there had been a lack of bereavement time given. What do you mean by that? Just people who've lost a family member who were not allowed leave to deal with that? Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And what kind of reason was given?
The military policies gives us very specific name or what kind of bereavement you're allowed to have or not allowed to have. So even let's say that you lose an aunt who was your mother for 20 years because she's under aunt, you will not get the bereavement even though she's considered a mother.
So I take it what you're saying is that these are not looked at as individual cases. That's kind of like a grid, and either you fit the grid or you don't fit the grid, which is extremely impersonal and not conducive to a happy workplace. Is that what you're telling us?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Just as a point of clarification, you said that the percentage of recruitment of the male and female was equal, and yet the composition of the forces is clearly not equal between males and females. Could you just clarify that point, please?
No, it's obviously the recruitment by the individual male versus female is absolutely not equal. I think I was answering the education level, male and female, is actually equal.
Yeah, okay. I thank you for that clarification. Madame Lamoropoulos, final 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think I'll be taking up the entire 4 minutes, but something that stuck out to me in Ms. Lane's testimony was the fact that obviously we spoke about family benefits and the fact that the CAF doesn't necessarily take into account when someone has a family, the fact that now many Canadian families are have 2 incomes and not just one, either by choice or by necessity. What changes would you make to the benefits that are there for families? And you also mentioned something that struck me a little, which was that people who don't have families that are in the CAF may not see changes to the way that the benefits benefit families. They might not see it in a great way. What do you think would make it fair for those who don't have families? What kinds of benefits would you think are necessary or important to include?
Okay, so strictly in the context of my own personal opinion as a researcher and spouse, and not as a D&D employee, I think one thing that could dramatically change the way that dual spouses are able to handle military life, as well as increase recruitment from ethnic minorities and new Canadians, would be to reinstate having CAF establishments in our major cities, the way that we did prior to a variety of base closures in, I believe, the 1990s. the places where people live in Canada, especially young people, non-white people, new Canadians, tech people live, are not necessarily where we have our main military installations. So there's a disconnect there. If you are an ambitious young person in a couple, if you want to join the military, it's very hard to uproot your entire life and go live in a small town, in a different province, in a rural community that you've never experienced. So that would kind of solve two birds with one stone. In terms of the fairness question, I think almost every policy that is family friendly can be made individual friendly as well, in terms of having the flexibility to take leave, for example, whether you need to care for a newborn child or whether you want to take a master's degree, whether you have elder care responsibilities. Every Canadian and every CAF member has something in their life that they could use a little bit of institutional flexibility with. And so currently we have policies that are designed obviously for families because that's a main concern, but to be able to involve people who don't necessarily have what we think of as a traditional family, to extend those leave options, for example, to parents or siblings or loved ones in different contexts would be one way of making the policies feel a little more fair, I think, because, nobody really wants to have a lot of sympathy for like, oh, the single person who doesn't have kids who's grumbling about taking the weekend so that their partner colleagues can do it. But the reality is that more and more people are choosing to be child-free or choosing to live in relationships that don't look like traditional marriages, and we have to value their contributions as well and take their concerns seriously. So there is some room there for improvement, I think.
Thank you very much. I'll cede the rest of my time, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Fisher is keen to get the 40 seconds.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Lambropoulos, and I'll take that 40 seconds with Ms. Lane if I could. What does this most recent Russian aggression do for recruitment? I'm from the Top Gun era when, it drove U.S. recruitment through the roof for something. So does this hinder it or does this enhance it for Canada?
I think it remains to be seen. As Dr. Okros said, people joined the CAF for all sorts of different reasons. We did see a bump during the conflict in Afghanistan from people who really wanted to serve their country in a particularly combat way. I think we can expect there to be more awareness of the Canadian Armed Forces as a career. And if the anticipated procurement projects come to force, new kit is always an exciting thing that you can promote in recruiting ads and that sort of thing. Not sure the F-35 counts as a Top Gun or not, but yeah, I would suspect that there will be an increase in interest in the CAF, but I think it remains to be seen whether that will actually lead to an increase in recruitment. And more importantly, are the people that are interested in joining the CAF because of the war in Ukraine likely to remain in the CAF when the war in Ukraine goes away? And I think that's, again, a different question.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. You've now ruined all those Top Gun movies for me and probably everyone else on the committee. Oh, my goodness. With that, I just wanted to thank both of you. You were extraordinary witnesses. You've certainly helped launch our study on recruitment and retention in a positive way. And you have both set out the complexities that are faced by the government, by the military, and indeed by Canadian society. But again, thank you for both of you for this hour of your time. It's been hugely valuable. With that, meeting is adjourned.